right. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar is part of National Drive Electric Week, which is an annual electric vehicle events campaign. Every year, local volunteers across the country and internationally organize local electric vehicle events. This year, we had lots of online as well as some in-person events, so you can check out driveelectricweek.org to find others. This event is presented locally by Plug-in America, but National Drive Electric Week is presented nationally by Plug-in America, the Electric Auto Association, and the Sierra Club. Okay, so today we'll be joined by Tony Brazel from the California Air Resources Board and Patricio Portillo from the NRDC. Also, my name is Kylie Morgan. I work at Plug-in America and manage National Drive Electric Week on our side. All right, before we get started, a huge thank you to our platinum sponsor, Nissan Leaf. They are the exclusive automotive sponsor of National Drive Electric Week and have been a sponsor since 2012. So they've really been a great supporter of our program, and we're really thankful for that support. Before we get started, I'm going to share a brief sponsor message.
To rack up 5 billion miles, you've got to be dependable. The all-electric 2020 Nissan Leaf. J.D. Power's most dependable compact car.
All right, now we're going to go back to our slide deck. All right, so now I'm going to toss it over to Tony, and he's going to tell us what this new clean truck regulation is all about.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here this morning. I'll go ahead and just get started. I do oversee our regulatory programs at the Air Resources Board, those that affect diesel trucks largely, and I've been with the board for more than 25 years. And I'll go ahead and give you an overview of what we're doing mostly in the heavy duty space associated with electrification. Next slide, please. So for those who aren't familiar, California has the worst air quality in the nation. The image on the right shows you that the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast have the most severe non-attainment in the United States. And generally, these highly polluted areas are where most of the people in California live. So the issue in California, we're obviously looking to address emissions as much as we can everywhere, but heavy-duty trucks and other sources that are federally regulated are the largest contributors at this point. And when we're looking at meeting the standards even out to 2031, the rules that we've adopted aren't enough, and we need to continue to look at other ways to get more emissions reductions. To give you a perspective, one of the regulations that was adopted back in 2008 is requiring that essentially every truck in the state have a 2010 or better engine in the next couple of years. Again, it was adopted 12 years ago, but that's one of the steps to try to improve our air quality as much as we can to meet a 2023 attainment deadline, and that still is not enough to even meet that deadline. Next slide, please. And then in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, California set some very ambitious targets to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. On the right, the image shows you how much of the GHG emissions are associated with each of the different economic sectors, and you see transportation is one of the largest. Sorry, the image there doesn't show the number very well, but that's 41% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with transportation. And then another thing that's relevant to electrification is that in California, our electricity is already relatively clean. A lot of our energy comes from renewable sources, but even the ones that aren't called renewable are non-polluting. And so there are requirements for the grid to keep getting cleaner. so that 60% of our electricity will be renewable by 2030, and that our electricity will actually be zero carbon by 2045. So when we're talking about transportation being fueled, whether you're using hydrogen from electrolysis, for instance, or electricity, that it will be zero carbon electricity here in the state. And I guess one other point to associate with that is the electrification actually enables meeting that target for our grid, because there's a number of advantages that you can actually see with electrification in terms of grid resiliency and ability to use renewable energy. So next slide. And so just to give you a sense of, ARB has been looking at how do you address GHG emissions, how do you address NOx emissions, and at the end of the day, the answer always comes back to electrification is one of the most important strategies that we can use. So broadly, all of these studies and policy documents point to zero emission needs to be in place everywhere feasible. Improve efficiency generally is also an important part of the goal. And then to use the cleanest combustion and cleaner fuels everywhere you can't go fully to zero emission. Next slide. And then very recently, the governor issued an executive order that established specific goals for heavy duty vehicles and light duty vehicles in California. When I say light duty, I'm talking about cars and light pickups. So the targets are shown here on the slide. So passenger car sales would have to be 100% zero emissions starting in 2035. But you see for the trucks that the goal is to have a complete conversion by 2045 everywhere feasible. That effectively means that most trucks sold after 2030 will have to be zero emission. And then that at our ports and rail yards, where there's high concentrations of trucks and frankly a lot of emissions locally, we established the goal of getting to zero emission by 2035. And then even as you see, the off-road equipment is also part of the overall strategy to try to electrify as much as possible there. And you may be aware, of course, that a number of forklifts and other types of equipment already electric or running on hydrogen, but this would go well beyond that. And so to meet those goals, I oversee our regulatory efforts in terms of the on-road market, but also other policies are going to be necessary to make this happen beyond just regulation. And incentives and other things will be part of the solution. And so as a state, I think over the last 5 years, we've been coordinating a lot more closely on all these overarching policies because electricity rates, projections of what's needed, and so all of these interrelate. And actually, in terms of even fuel diversity and other things, everything now overlaps so much that we're actually being much more cognizant of working together to make sure that all of these different policies lead to the same path. Next slide, please. Okay, this one, the image got messed up a little bit, but I think you can still see it. The yellow boxes represent the zero emission regulations that ARB has already approved with the check marks, and the ones that we're working on are going forward. Then the bottom half shows you the ones that are associated with emissions. So just briefly on the left side in the yellow, so we've adopted a regulation that requires all transit buses to go to zero emission by 2040, more essentially. An airport shuttle regulation that requires all airport shuttles to go to zero emission by 2035, and that's a firm deadline. There's a powertrain certification requirement for zero emission vehicles, and that's for the medium and heavy duty. That's essentially a mechanism to make sure that there is information out to a potential buyer as to exactly what the characteristics are associated with their vehicle, some basic warranty protections associated with that as well, so that people can compare future vehicles to each other. There's a ships at birth regulation that effectively requires ships when they're docked to plug in rather than running their diesel or rather than running their engines and continuing to pollute while they're at the dock. And then the advanced clean trucks regulation, which I will describe in some detail. And then in the circle is the advanced clean fleets regulation, which I'll also describe very briefly today, and that we're working on that now. And then just above that, the zero-emission TRUs. TRU is a transport refrigeration unit. So these are the, call them reefers typically, on trucks and also even on rail cars. AirB is right now working on a regulation that would require them to be plugged in when they are stationary in essence, rather than, again, running the diesel engine and creating emissions at the property. And then on the bottom, I'll just mention briefly the heavy-duty low NOx omnibus regulation. That is, in essence, set new engine standards starting in effectively 2024 and then 2027. That will be essentially 90% cleaner than engines are today. And so that and the zero-emission truck rule together will dramatically reduce emissions from trucks going forward. But that applies to only the ones sold in California. It doesn't necessarily apply to the ones from out of state that come into California. So next slide, please. And this is the regulation that our board approved that requires zero-emission trucks to be sold by manufacturers if they're going to sell in California. This was adopted in June, or approved in June. In effect, these percentages are the percentage of the sales that need to be zero emission. There is credit if manufacturers are selling plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, they can get credit for selling those, but they can only use plug-in hybrid electric vehicles for half the credit. So there will have to be zero-emission vehicles sold to meet the requirement. And you see the percentages increase. On the next slide, I'll show you what those categories are in terms of the weight class. I'm sorry, if you go back just one second. And then there's some flexibility for manufacturers, and this regulation isn't so different than our advanced clean cars regulation, where again manufacturers are required to sell a portion of their sales as zero emissions. And then at the bottom, what this translates to is roughly 100,000 zero emission trucks being sold by 2030 in California, and then 300,000 by 2035. To put that in context, there's nearly 2 million vehicles in California, so that's roughly 15% by 2035 would actually be zero emission, so it's not an overnight transition. Okay, and we'll go ahead to the next slide. And then this kind of gives you an image of what we're talking about. So the class 2B and 3 starts at a pickup like an F-250, clearly includes vans and other lighter trucks. And the class 4 through 8 category is any straight truck that's bigger than an F-350, if you're familiar with that. And then the class 7 and 8 tractors is looking to target the tractor market. There is a lot of short haul applications like drayage that use tractors, but clearly there's long haul as well. And so right now it's harder to predict, I guess, when long haul will have a zero emissions as a practical option. And so that's something that's important as we move forward. Next slide, please. And so just to give you an overview, these are the benefits in California associated with the regulation. So even though the trucks cost more upfront and there's infrastructure that's required, which also has a significant investment, when you look at the life of the vehicle, we still estimate that there would be over $6 billion in net savings over time because of the fuel savings and maintenance savings. In terms of health, there's an additional $9 billion in estimated health benefits associated with the different impacts on health. And then, this is California. So in California, there would be a net increase of 7,500 jobs when you factor in all of the changes associated with broader electrification. And that has a lot to do with installing the infrastructure associated with that, but also vehicle manufacturing in the state. And then, of course, it would reduce energy use and petroleum dependence, and there are other benefits associated with electrification. Next slide, please. And this just graphically shows you what the emissions would do in black without without the regulation. As you see, the NOx emissions would tend to plateau and the projected PM emissions would increase, and that's simply because vehicle miles traveled continue to increase in the future. But with this regulation, it would achieve the benefits shown with the green. And you see the PM benefits go beyond just reducing exhaust. There's actually reduced brake wear associated with electrification as well because of regenerative braking. Next slide, please. And then on the greenhouse gas, we have a similar trend. You see that the different policies we put in place are resulting in decreases, but eventually it starts to plateau. And now with the electrification effort, they could continue to bring that down. Next slide, please. One other thing that just want to brief you, that part of the manufacturer sales requirement, the board did approve a requirement for companies to report information to us one time by April of next year. Any company with 50 or more trucks, or any company that has a revenue of over 50 million and has at least one truck, will have to report information to us about how their vehicles are used and the information about the home base location where the truck's associated with that. And the reason that is there as a requirement is having that information is critical for us to understand what any strategy going forward looks like on an individual company basis, because now we are working on a fleet rule where we would need to specify here's what individual companies need to do. And so having that level of detail is very critical to figure out which companies can move ahead earlier or which types of trucks, and which ones need more time given the state of technology and how the market develops. So there's a reporting element that by April we should get a lot of information from tens of thousands of companies on their truck use at a level of detail that isn't available anywhere else. Next slide. And then this is kind of closing out the regulatory strategy. Our board did adopt in the resolution that they want us to come back next year with the fleet rule that I refer to, and to target meeting these particular goals here. And so you see that 2035 that all trucks serving the ports or drayage trucks would need to be zero emission, but also public fleets and last mile delivery. Last mile delivery is a loose term, but generally these are trucks that are in town doing local deliveries like package delivery, food and beverage, and so on. So we are looking at that category, and the economics actually look favorable in some of those categories today. In a matter of 3 to 5 years, we anticipate that on a total cost of ownership, many of these will actually be competitive with diesel, and in time are expected to be lower cost options than diesel. And it's not just us, there's about 10, 12 different studies, a lot done by industry, that ultimately have the same conclusions. And then you see 2040, the categories there, we're looking to make a full transition. And you see there that we're including utility fleets. So these are a lot of work trucks, for instance. And so the NZEV or the plug-in hybrid may be necessary there for different reasons. We don't think in the last mile delivery that a plug-in hybrids would necessarily be needed just because of their distance they travel, and they are typically a return to base operation. And then lastly, by 2045, the goal is to make a full transition to zero emission, again, everywhere feasible. And right now, some specialty equipment maybe looks a little more challenging, and the long haul market, that does require an infrastructure to be in place. But that is a long time out in the future, and so we'll be looking at strategically how to do that. Next slide, please. And then another thing you might want to be aware of is, as part of our regulatory effort, and we have been working with other states, 15 other states and the District of Columbia have signed on to a memorandum of understanding to support electrification in their states as well. So the MOU specifically sets sales targets of at least 30% of sales for medium and heavy duty trucks to be zero emission by 2030, and then all sales to be zero emission by 2050. Some of these states are looking to adopt the California regulation as is. So it is likely that within the next year or two, that other states will actually adopt the same California regulation. And the Clean Air Act does allow California to have different requirements than other states, and other states can copy California, can't create their own rule. And so there looks like a number are looking to do that. And then of course they're looking at how do you enable broader electrification, including how do you support infrastructure and other things to make it happen. Next slide. And then this is the fleet regulation that I referred to. We call it the fleet regulation as a loose term, but we are looking at different strategies that may not regulate the fleet directly, at least not all of them. So we're in the process of doing this right now, and we are expecting to take a recommendation to our board in probably December of next year. But we are looking at starting with larger companies or entities, and where electric vehicles are already available and where they're most suitable. And we're starting with that 8,500 pound GVWR, that class 2B and 3 category. But we're also trying to keep an open mind here and look at cargo bikes and other lighter vehicles that are also potentially being used for transportation needs beyond passenger transportation. And then broadly, the strategy is to have a single rulemaking, even though there might be different elements within the rule for the different truck categories. And clearly, as I mentioned, there's earlier target dates to be zero emission for certain categories of trucks, especially those that look like they're in the best position to electrify sooner rather than later. And so as I touched on, green contracting concept would be, in essence, if you're a retailer, that you would have to hire the fleets that have the zero emission trucks. Could be an idea even if you don't own trucks yourself. Zero emission truck purchases, which would be fairly straightforward as a requirement, or setting some milestones for a percentage of the fleet to be zero emission by a certain point in time and then have that increase over time. And then lastly, the zero emission zone concept, we are specifically looking at that for drayage trucks because they do enter a gate, and it's very straightforward to say, hey, if you're entering the gate, you either need to be zero emission or meet a given requirement. That is the way the diesel rules actually work today. But today, it doesn't look like the zero emission zone concept would be beyond what the drayage trucks. But broadly, we're looking to make sure that we can maximize the use of ZEBs. Clearly make sure that the sales that we're requiring manufacturers to make, there's effectively a buyer. And also, of course, if we can get more purchasers to be zero emission beyond what the manufacturers have to sell, we, of course, will look at strategies to do that. Next slide, please. And then information on anything associated with the fleets is available on the link. So if you are a fleet and you see that you're going to have to report, we will have information available there on how to do that. We're in the process of putting those guidelines together. And then if you're interested in the regulation that the board approved, then the first link will give you information on that. So that concludes my slides. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Also, just a note for anyone watching, feel free to use the comments on the Facebook Live post to ask any questions. We will have some time for Q&A at the end to talk about, how this regulation came about and elaborate more on the impact it could have for clean air in California. So next, we're going to go on, move on to Patricio from NRDC.
Thanks, Kylie, and Plug in America for hosting such a great conversation today. And thank you all for tuning in on a Sunday morning, or I guess afternoon, depending on where you are. I know we're competing with football plans right now, and it's just generally a crazy time, but it's really exciting to see the level of interest in this topic. So my name is Patricio Portillo, and I'm a transportation analyst in the Climate and Clean Energy Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And I work specifically on the Clean Vehicles and Fuels team. I've been with NRDC for a little over a year, and before that I worked at the National Governors Association, so working with state executive branches, and before that on the US Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, so federal legislation. But like I said, I'm with the Climate and Clean Energy Program, which, as you can imagine, is pretty broad. We cover a lot, but all of it, at its core, is focused on cutting back the greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change and reducing harmful air pollution. This means our work includes advocating for the transition away from dirty fossil fuel energy to clean renewables like wind and solar, reducing the overall energy we consume while still continuing to grow the economy, and then the work that my team does, which is cleaning up pollution from the transportation sector. Next slide, please. And integrated throughout all of our advocacy is a strong emphasis on people. That means centering equity and inclusion in policy, focusing on improving public health outcomes, helping consumers save money so you have more dollars in your wallet, supporting good job creation, and ensuring a just transition, really making sure that we bring everyone along. Now, moving to zero-emission vehicles, or ZEVs, perfectly, I think, encapsulates this work. But let me explain that a bit. So next slide, please. So like I said, my title is Transportation Analyst, but really what I am is an advocate for the right to breathe clean air. A right that you would think is pretty obvious and should be guaranteed, but unfortunately for millions of Americans, it's just not a given. Now, one of the largest contributors to poor local air quality are the medium and heavy duty trucks. So that's, as Tony said, everything from your F-250 pickup trucks all the way up to 18-wheelers that we see rumbling by on the highway. And I know Tony covered this, some of this already, but I think it's worth reinforcing. When we talk about the medium and heavy duty trucks, these are predominantly diesel burning vehicles. So they certainly produce greenhouse gas emissions, but they're a huge source of NOx and particulate matter and a leading cause of hazardous local air pollution. The respiratory and cardiovascular diseases that these diesel emissions produce, it costs our society billions of dollars a year. The health impacts are severe, and the communities that suffer the most are the ones that obviously live adjacent to freight hubs. So around ports, warehouses, freeways, and guess what? These communities are predominantly communities of color and low-income communities. So one group that I actually worked with recently that represents a majority Latino community, they did a truck count, which means they counted the number of trucks that passed through their community on a given day. Guess how many trucks passed through? I wish we were in person so I could get some responses from the audience, but I'll just tell you. So on average, it was 1,000 trucks per hour. Imagine if 1,000 18-wheelers drove by your home every hour spewing toxic emissions. So at its core, electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles is about equity. It's about developing policies that will help disproportionately benefit communities that have borne a disproportionate share of the pollution burden and suffered from toxic air for far too long. The market for zero-emission trucks is still nascent, but there's tons of interest from both policymakers and industry, and it's for several reasons. First and foremost, it's because of the big public health benefits of zero-emission technology. There's also the potential cost savings to fleets from filling up with cheaper electricity and savings to all consumers from downward pressure on electric rates. And then finally, the potential for new manufacturing jobs, as well as infrastructure jobs, and the reinvestment of those fuel savings into local economies. Next slide. Because of the substantial fuel cost savings from filling up with potentially less expensive electricity, zero-emission trucks can be economically competitive over the entire lifetime of the vehicle. This is probably obvious, but I think worth pointing out, but by and large, medium and heavy duty trucks are used for commercial purposes. That means, it's companies making purchases rather than individuals. Now, individuals buy things in a much more emotional way. I might want leather seats and a sunroof, and you might want something totally different. But businesses make buying decisions in a much more rational way. So there's a huge opportunity here to very quickly ramp up adoption of electric trucks if manufacturers can provide vehicles that are cost competitive with fossil fuel trucks and can get the job done. So we're seeing big companies like Amazon, IKEA, Frito-Lay, FedEx, all pre-ordering thousands of zero-emission trucks that will hit our roads in the next several years. And here on the screen, it's a scattering of headlines that have come out over the past year to really show the strength of this growing market. But to boost this nascent industry and accelerate the transition to electric trucks, states are the ones leading the way. Most recently, I worked to help get that multi-state memorandum of understanding signed by 15 states in the District of Columbia that Tony mentioned. And it's worth noting that this is a very diverse array of bipartisan states, which again, I think speaks to the broad appeal of moving the transition to zero emission forward and the imperative, again, to clean up local air. Now that this MOU is out, other states are looking to sign on as well, and the 16 signatories are working collaboratively to develop an action plan to help them reach their goals. And this action plan will essentially look like a policy roadmap, a menu of policy options for states to consider, and it will reflect valuable stakeholder feedback and input. So something that we're doing now and may be of interest to folks in this audience is helping stakeholders get organized and ensure that their voice is heard in this process. To do that, we helped host a webinar with over 300 participants from across the country a few weeks ago, really just to discuss the MOU, its contents, and next steps. Now, from a policy perspective, there are sort of three core pillars, if you will, that are needed to move to zero-emission truck technology. Next slide. First, we need to increase the supply of clean electric vehicles because people and companies, they can't buy what isn't available for sale on the market. This means policies like California's Advanced Clean Truck Rule that Tony and his team worked so hard on getting adopted, as well as making strategic public investments. And this is because government can help kickstart an industry by taking risks that the private sector may be unable or unwilling to bear. Next, we need to increase demand. So getting people to buy EVs through monetary and non-monetary incentives. For example, this could be purchase incentives to help make that upfront cost of switching to zero emission more affordable. There are also policies like the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule to make sure that the clean truck technology will be purchased and deployed in the areas that really need them most. And then finally, the third piece is building up the ecosystem to support the transition to electric vehicles. This includes making sure there are enough electric vehicle chargers or hydrogen fueling stations and that there is this highly skilled workforce to service these new vehicles and their infrastructure. One final point I'll add before I turn it back to Kylie, and maybe we could talk about this more during Q&A, but it's the importance of developing strong emission standards in California, and then under the Federal Clean Air Act, exporting those policies to other states. So now that we have the Advanced Clean Truck Rule in California, which is a foundational policy because it guarantees supply of these vehicles, we're working very hard to get other states to adopt this rule and complementary policies as well. So that's a quick snapshot of why we think it's so critical that we adopt zero-emission trucks and some core strategies for policymakers to help accelerate this transition. And I think with that, I'll kick it over to Kylie for some Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Patricio. If anyone has any questions, this is his contact information. Okay, so now I'll ask our two presenters to turn on their cameras and we'll go to our Q&A. Okay, actually, before we get started with the Q&A, I did want to share a few resources with everyone. So, if you're thinking about going electric with your personal vehicle, you can visit plugstar.com to compare the different electric vehicles out there. You can also find purchase and charging incentives by zip code. And then you can find dealerships who have been EV certified or EV trained by the manufacturer. In addition, if you have any questions about EVs in general, you can call our EV support program or email us. The first question is free, but after that, we do ask that you donate to our organization because we are a nonprofit. And then also coming up in April, we have a similar electric vehicle events campaign where we'll most likely have both online and in-person events going on all across the United States. You can find those events at driveelectricearthday.org. And with that, I'll go to all of our videos. All right. So yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for sharing that. And I have a couple questions to start, but again, if anyone has any questions who's watching, please use the Facebook comments to send those in. All right. So first question, how might this transition to zero-emission trucks affect truck drivers?
Oh, Tony, you want to go ahead?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. Thanks. That's a great question. You know, when we talk about this transition and how it might affect truck drivers, I think it's really important to bear in mind what these drivers are already dealing with. You know, the first is that they are one of the main groups impacted by diesel emissions. You know, they're the drivers sitting in the cab, either stuck in traffic or in long lines to load and unload their goods while the engine idles. The second thing we need to consider is what the current labor practices are in the trucking industry. So currently, truck driver misclassification, which I'll just explain that quickly. It's where a company calls them an independent contractor to avoid paying good wages, providing benefits, training, safe work environment, et cetera. You know, that truck driver misclassification is unfortunately rampant, and it leads to incredibly extortionary practices where, you know, for example, a company might lease a new truck to an independent driver, many of whom English is not the first language, in return for them driving for the company and allowing the company to garnish their wages. And the lease rates are typically exorbitant, and the company controls the routes the drivers get, which determines how lucrative they are. And it basically gives the company complete financial control over the driver, and it essentially results in indentured servitude. So the transition to electric trucks, it gives policymakers this crucial opportunity to develop programs that support drivers and penalize these predatory business practices. But if it's not done right, it could actually push more drivers into this type of arrangement and shift the burden of complying with new emission or technology standards from the companies to the individual drivers. So as with anything, you know, how these policies are ultimately structured will drive either the positive or negative outcomes, which is why engagement with the impacted workers and communities early on in the policy development process is so crucial.
Yeah, and then I could just maybe add a little. I mean, that's one of the things we're looking to address in terms of our regulatory strategy is where does it make this most sense to move first? And keep in mind that a lot of people, when we talk about trucks, always assume long haul, semi-tractor on the road kind of thing. But again, when we're looking at it, we're looking at absolutely every category possible. So somebody who's in a van putting in a satellite TV at your house would be someone who would electrify as well. And then, you know, broadly, I can say I've actually driven one electric truck myself, but what we hear from people who do drive them, including the semis or especially the semis, at first, they're really quiet, obviously, inside. They're much smoother, a lot less vibration, so a fatigue and other things like that, it becomes a lot less of an issue. It's like driving a car where, again, truck drivers will tell us that there's a pretty significant fatigue effect associated with all of the vibration of the engine. And then clearly there's just the direct impact of emissions to the driver, depending on what you're exactly doing. Because as Patricio mentioned, if you're idling in place for hours on end, then you're there exposed to those emissions firsthand. And you're probably in an area where there's a lot of other trucks as well, including in traffic and so on. So there are a lot of potential benefits associated with it beyond just even their quality and health. And again, the trick though is to make sure that the trucks are placed in service where they can meet the needs of the fleet. So we're looking to minimize any disruptions, but clearly this is going to be some change. And as he kind of showed on a number of the slides, the number of companies are embracing a transition and looking to help accelerate it. And even in our regulatory strategy, to tell you the truth, we several years ago were looking at a fleet requirement only without the manufacturer part. And some of the major companies came in and said, we're not big enough to get manufacturers to make these things. So the state of California needs to step up and do that part. And that's kind of why we took the approach of ensuring that manufacturers make the trucks available. And then again, when we look at the economics and you look at some of the studies done by the trucking industry, they're projecting that in 2025 to 2030, that most trucks are going to be more economic than diesel. And so the market is eventually going to head that way. We're trying to make sure they do it sooner. And with our policies that they have the ability to make those decisions, to make those investments now, rather than waiting just in case kind of thing. And so that's a large part of what these policies are about.
I can just add one thing. Tony, that's a great point about the driving experience. I also was fortunate enough to test drive a 18 a zero emission 18-wheeler, and it was kind of surreal because there was like a drone overhead, like filming, and the buzzing from the drone was louder than the actual vehicle operation, which was just like, not something you would ever, it just felt like a Twilight Zone thing, like driving this massive truck and it making zero noise, and then this tiny little drone making much more noise than it.
I'll actually add one more. The utility bucket truck, for example. A lot of times those are parked all day, somebody working on the line or something like that. There's actually a safety advantage by having an electric truck without a diesel engine making a lot of noise, so the person on the ground can actually talk to the person in the bucket without having to yell or use a walkie-talkie, that kind of thing. And so there are these other advantages that a number of these companies actually look to, and there's a value to them to have that as well.
And then another question, which I'm sure is top of people's minds, are like 18, so it sounds like the 18-wheeler electric vehicles are available, but what's available now and what's still being developed, as far as electric trucks go?
Let's say Patricia would go beyond me. I don't have my list in front of me, but I can say right now, my understanding is BYD has an electric tractor that's available. I don't know what its range characteristics is, but it's not that long. But I think 5 or 6 tractors or semi-trucks should be commercially available in the next 2 years. My understanding is that both Volvo and Daimler, their truck should be available for commercial sale, I believe, either this year or very early next. And then you've heard Tesla and a number of others are shooting for the late 2021 or 2022. So it looks like there's going to be 5, 6, maybe even more. Even Peterbilt and Kenworth are looking at the truck market. I'm not 100% sure if they're shooting for tractors or work trucks. But Patricia, maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, so CalSTART has a terrific zero emission technology inventory that really shows globally, because again, this is a global market. So looking just at North America, I think is a little limited. But if we look globally, there are a number of different vehicles from all sorts of manufacturers, both the traditional truck manufacturers as well as a lot of new entrants like Rivian, Tesla, Arrival, that are beginning to produce these vehicles. And while we're, like I said, at a very nascent part of this industry, over the next several years, before the Advanced Clean Truck Rule actually comes into effect, we're going to be seeing much more volume and offerings from these OEMs, and that's the trajectory we're on, and it will just continue to grow over the next 10 years or so. But for example, I think they have about, on this zero emission technology inventory, I think like around 50 or so different manufacturers producing all types of vehicles, both from, all the way from the class 2B all the way up to the class 8, that are going to be released by 2023. And again, that's globally, but the policies that we put in place today will really help drive, where those vehicles are deployed, and where the investments for those vehicles get made, and where the manufacturing jobs from the building of those vehicles will occur as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add a little. Our HBIP program provides a rebate at point of purchase for people who are buying a lot of these vehicles. On our website, there's a list of all of those trucks, and I think there's on order more than 100 different models that are electric that are available and have been available for years. But some of these other ones coming are going to be from the major manufacturers that have largely not been serving the market. So there's quite a few out there, but not in the semi-tractor category right now.
Got it. And Patricio, you mentioned that this is also going to create a lot of jobs. So maybe for either of you, but first, Patricio, what are those kind of good clean energy jobs people can expect?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And, when I talk to states all over the country, that's often like the top of mind thing, particularly now in this, looking at the economic situation in, both our country, but globally as well, is like, how can we attract investments and jobs to our states? And not just any jobs, but, good, high quality jobs. So, today we're seeing billions of dollars of investments that are pouring into zero emission technology, and it's happening all over the world. And most, if not all, of the vehicle manufacturers are, on record talking about, the zero emission as like the future of their industry. So it's not a matter of if so much as when and where. So, with that being said, the supply chain to manufacture zero-emission vehicles, it's different than a fossil fuel vehicle. It involves mining more raw materials, processing and refining that mined product, and then building the battery components, and finally the assembly of the vehicle. So there's a lot that has to happen before we actually get to that assembly point. And unfortunately, like the initial investments in the zero-emission vehicle supply chain, with the battery manufacturing being the most lucrative and important, are mostly happening in China, South Korea, and in parts of Europe. And that's because these countries or regions, they have much more defined visions for this clean technology future. The US needs a vision and a commitment now that provides that market clarity, incentives for domestic manufacturing, workforce development, and strong labor standards. Those things will really help the US attract and retain private capital and high quality jobs. So like I said, numerous states are actively exploring this, but they need a strong federal partner that's committed to this future technology as well.
I can just add to that a little bit. I mean, so the obvious job category is associated with the infrastructure, installing it in the first place, and then ultimately maintaining it going forward. And then here in California, we are seeing manufacturing actually increase in terms of vehicles. So with buses in particular, since we did the bus rule first, and buses were ahead of the rest of the market. BYD in Lancaster was new. I don't even know how many years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And they have thousands of workers at this point, and they're looking to now expand into the truck market beyond just what they're doing for buses. Proterra is assembling batteries in the Bay Area and built a facility in Southern California to build the buses as well. And then we're seeing some of the truck manufacturers looking to do similar things. And so there are other associated jobs, but as mentioned, some of these are going to be vehicles built elsewhere in the U.S. potentially, and then delivered here to California. And that's what normally happens. But there's also looks like battery manufacturing, support and maintenance network, and clearly the infrastructure build out. All of those are going to be associated with jobs that come to California.
And also,
and other parts of the U.S.
If I could just add as well, like the supply chain that I mentioned, all of those aspects of it, that it's relevant to zero emission technology, but it's also relevant to, like our cell phones and military hardware. So the investments or the incentives that policymakers put in place today to build out that supply chain will benefit both, our general economy that's increasingly connected and utilizing more and more electronics, as well as this transition to zero emission vehicles. So there's, it's kind of a win-win in a lot of ways.
Nice. And we do have one question in the comments. So will it be better than the diesel regulations? And I guess so the question just said, will it be better than diesel regulations? So maybe we can answer it in the sense of how much more emissions would it save than these regulations that just make diesel engines more efficient?
Tony, this is your I'll leave this to you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I guess I don't know how to answer that in a direct way, I suppose. I mean, as you know, the ARB is looking at every possible strategy to reduce emissions, both criteria pollutants at the local level. And frankly, our strategies and direction from the legislature is to start looking at, or it has not started, is to focus on community level exposure at levels of intersections and warehouses and other things like that. Because even though the state is clearly making progress on reducing emissions overall, we still have these high concentrations of emissions in certain pockets and other areas too. So those all kind of go together. And so as I try to indicate, the zero emission truck policy is looking to electrify where we can get the manufacturers to build the trucks in the first place, so that there's more available. But then the engine standards, again, 90% cleaner than they are today in the real world is effectively the goal, because even though the standards are relatively low, I guess, I don't know what the right term is to use is, The reality is that when trucks do a lot of stop and go driving and idling and are in traffic, those emission control systems don't actually work as well as they do in the tests. And so emissions in the real world actually aren't as low as what we were hoping that those standards would have done. And that's part of the reason to do that. And going forward, we're also looking at strategies on making sure that trucks are actually maintained and that the emission control systems are just working all the time rather than when it fails, taking several months to a year to fix it. All of that's part of the problem. So I don't know if that was what the question was looking to achieve or to address, but I can say that as part of the regulatory process, what it will mean for the truck owner and truck driver, that is something we work through. A lot of times industry by industry, we'll even look at it truck by truck. And so we do meet with individual companies to say, here's the approach we're looking at, what does it mean for you? And does this approach work or does it not work? So I don't know if that was part of that question. And as I mentioned, our general approach right now is that we're looking to target bigger companies first, but very importantly, I think to Patricia's other point is, if a bigger company is subbing out all of its work, then we want that company to be treated exactly the same in terms of the emissions in the trucks as any other company that might own all of their trucks to do its work. And so that will, to a degree, have some impact on this owner-operator model. And as long as the two different business models ultimately get to the same place, then we're going to get those benefits everywhere. And I think that enables a lot of flexibility for the way the truck market already works today, or the transportation market works. And so we always try to craft strategies that work with the way business works today. But obviously, we are going to, our purpose of the regulations is to change what they might otherwise do in their normal schedule and maybe have them do some things a little earlier than they normally would.
Maybe if I can just quickly add a little bit to that as well. Like, the end goal obviously is a fully zero emission fleet. We need that from the public health and climate change perspective. So this advanced clean truck rule, it increases the number of these vehicles that are going to be on the road. We can't make that switch overnight. So over the next 15, 20 years, fossil fuel vehicles are going to continue to be sold. So these emission standards, like the heavy duty omnibus rule that Tony mentioned, they'll help tighten the screws and reduce emissions from new fossil fuel vehicles that will continue to be sold. So they're really, it's hard to just kind of pull them apart and examine them separately. They're very complementary policies, because the one gets us towards our overall goal and the other brings down emissions in the near term. And it's actually when we talk to states about adopting California's advanced clean truck rule, we're also encouraging them to adopt this heavy duty omnibus rule as well, and really as a package, because of the holistic perspective that we want to have in terms of moving us to the place that we want to be with a fully zero emission fleet.
And I guess I'll just throw one more thing out there, since if a number of you either have trucks or do operate in California. One of the other policies is our low carbon fuel standard that's trying to reduce the carbon intensity of all of our transportation fuels. But what that means for somebody who owns an electric truck and charges it with their own charger is that they can earn the credits and sell that to the refiners. And those credits right now are worth more than the electricity you put in your truck. So you can have effectively zero cost fuel for having an electric truck. And that's a huge savings, especially if you're spending $20,000, $30,000 a year in fuel. That's why the economics look very interesting, even if you pay more upfront for that truck. So we're actually in a situation where we might see a win-win-win-win scenario. And even if you go look on the internet and look up Arrival, there's videos of them showing you their vehicle for UPS. It's better in every way, according to them, space and everything else. It's lighter. And they're saying that it will cost the same upfront, not $50,000 more upfront, for instance. And it's just a matter of time before that becomes common. So whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or maybe Arrival is even sooner than that, there's a lot of opportunity here. And if that happens, the market's going to take off very fast. And so everybody will be better off in that case.
And I'll add one more point. This is good, Tony. You're like making me think of other things that I want to say. You know, it's great that California has this low carbon fuel standard, but you know, many states don't have that in place. But we've done the modeling on the total cost of ownership and the fuel cost savings. And for many vehicles, depending on the rates, and I don't want to get too much into electric rates because that's just like a whole beast of its own. But depending on how the rates are structured in a state, you know, that fuel savings can still be very substantial without these low carbon fuel standards as well. So, you know, it's not just California that can, you know, if you operate a fleet in other states as well, you can also reap pretty substantial savings.
Great. Yeah, that's good to hear. And I think it looks like we are almost out of time. So do either of you have like any last comments you'd like to leave people with, maybe for other states who are considering adopting this? Yeah.
Well, so if there are other states that are looking at it, I mean, one, we're in coordination with a number of those states, and to the extent that we craft our regulations in a way that makes it easier for those states to adopt them, we're definitely open to doing that. Because again, they would have to copy what California does, but we can also set it up to make it a lot easier to do. And we do believe that there's an interest, at least in certain elements of it, of what we do going forward. And so that's one of the things we'll be paying attention to, because we see that as benefiting California too, is more states and there's more sales nationwide. Clearly sales are increasing in other countries. All of that is going to improve the volume and pricing associated with the vehicles too, and frankly the information available out there, because I do recognize that a company who might be looking at an electric truck today is like, I don't know a whole lot about it, there's not a lot of history, and so we are collecting data and other things like that on a lot of these trucks and demonstrations, and making that publicly available too, just to help provide that kind of background and give people an understanding of what the real world experience actually is with these earlier models too.
Great. And yeah, California and Tony and his team, they're great partners, and they have tons of expertise and information on this. You know, if you're another state or stakeholders or, you know, whatever you may be, you're interested in this topic, I think I would just say that, you know, we're at a very early stage of this whole process, and, you know, there's a lot more questions than there are answers right now. And if you want to be a part of, you know, developing those answers and figuring out, you know, what are the right policies to really move, accelerate this market, I'd say, you know, please reach out. You know, my email's in the slides. Will help you get plugged in and, you know, figure out ways in which your voice can be heard throughout this process. I think Kylie, I think you might be muted.
Okay, here you go.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say thank you so much for joining us. I feel like today was a really cool discussion of this regulation and its goals, and also the kind of ancillary benefits it presents to the economy and to jobs around the U.S. So if anyone is interested, excuse me, on other topics about electric vehicles, we have similar online events like this covering topics such as solar, how EVs can help utilities with the grid, and different topics like that on driveelectricweek.org. There's also a page where you can view all the online events by title and description, so you can kind of browse through all the topics, see what you want to learn about. All right, well, thank you for joining us, and everyone have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Goodbye.